Welcome to Inside the Set with Set Decor. Inside the Set is a series that focuses on the design and decor of stories that excite us and ignite our imaginations, where we get to discuss the collaborations between production designers and set decorators, and hear firsthand accounts of how those works of art came to be, from their inception, ideas on a page, through completion, where we sit in the dark and experience them collectively.
Welcome to Inside the Set with Set Decor. I'm Gene Serdena SDSA, and I'm pleased to welcome set decorator Larry Diaz, SDSA, and production designer Paul D. Austerberry to discuss their exquisite work and creative collaboration on the new film version of the musical, The Color Purple. Larry and Paul, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us. Pleasure.
I have to just ask straight out the gate. Had either of you done a musical before?
I haven't.
And nor had I.
Okay. So why don't we talk a little bit about how you got involved with The Color Purple? Let's start with you, Paul. Tell us a little bit about that.
I had a call about 6 months before we started prep with Blitz, the director, and I was in London working on a film at the time, and it was a really interesting chat. You know, we talked about music. I did not actually know much about the musical, which it was also a very popular musical on Broadway twice, I think, 2005 and 2015. And that was an amazing challenge to try to accommodate what he needed. And it was a great experience.
Larry, let's talk about how you got involved.
Paul and I had started on another project in Los Angeles, and it ended up going down, and they sort of shelved the project. And then that was our first meeting that we knew each other. And then we did a quick commercial together. And then, all this time passed. And then remember that, Paul?
Yeah, we did.
And so then he called me up to say, hey, I got this meeting, and he just kind of wanted to check in and see if I might be available. And it was going to be filming in Atlanta, and Paul had not worked in Atlanta before that. And he just wanted to make sure that, we could kind of get a really good crew together. And I let him know that I had a great crew in place there. And then I suggested some people for art direction as well. And then it all kind of just came together.
Paul, what were some of the early conversations that you had with the director that sort of set you forward on sort of what some of the visual guidelines for the film were?
Well, the important thing for Blitz and this particular film is that, we have Celie's imagination. As most people probably know, it's a pretty sad tale, but it's all about her imagination to get into this sort of musicals and out into this a bigger visual world, which she'd never been a part of. And so he said, we should be very, very free with thinking about how we can bring her imagination into some of the musical numbers. So that was a pretty exciting thing to have told to you, because it just opens things up. It's not just a pure period film, set 1905 to 1945. We had this opportunity to just get into her imagination, get into some, more interesting, different kind of spaces.
What about you, Larry? Was there anything in particular that, conversations that you may have had with the director that influenced some of the direction that you took?
For me, what made it really interesting is that Celie's character in the Spielberg version of the movie, it was very bleak. And it was just like, you didn't really ever get a sense of hope. She was so taken advantage of and just so beaten down. And, finally at the end, she kind of like pulls through. But what I liked about Blitz's idea and handling it in this way and going into her head is that it was hopeful. And you really realize, she never really gave up hope. And she always kind of lived this fantasy, the fantasy life that we all have, where you kind of imagine this might happen to you or this could happen to you. And she didn't lose that. And it made her character more hopeful. And I think it just sort of opened up how we could handle everything, treat everything from a visual perspective.
I think often the absence of things is a very interesting way to develop a character. And so I noticed this through line in the film where, when we're first introduced to Celie's world, there's a kind of austerity to it in terms of like an absence of pattern mostly. And the colors were either very muted or in some cases monochromatic. And I thought there was a really interesting color story that was going on in the film where gradually we were introduced to more and more vivid colors and introduced to pattern and stuff. It was a really exciting thing to watch that and also know that it's a very deliberate aspect of design and decor. So I wanted to see if you could talk about that a bit.
one of the things that I was really interesting for me and for Paul to do was to kind of stay true to the period and the situation in which people were living. We're talking about the turn of the century in the rural South. So what we didn't want to do was have it be too glossy, too glitzy, or unrealistic. Mr.'s character had inherited land, and he was probably more wealthy than your average person would have been. But still, we didn't want that to not be told in a proper way. It was funny because there were times in the movie where Blitz wanted to represent change, so that we could see that, time had passed. And, he was like, oh, should that be all new furniture? And I'm like, no way. People at that time did not do that. Their clothes would change. Maybe their hairstyle would change. And you'd see maybe a few things would be added. But his initial thing, and I think it's partially because he's not American and he didn't he didn't know of really the history of the rural South, of the Depression, of all, the Civil War, of all these things that were taking place. And that people just didn't have drastic change like that. It was very subtle. Even in my growing up in California in a rural environment, my mom had the same couch my whole life, So that was one of the things that I really wanted to kind of push in that, is I didn't want it to get too glitzy or too glossy and feel unrealistic. And we got to have those moments though when Celie went into her head, then it was kind of got to really sort of let loose.
Yeah. So as far as the color, there's lots of photographs of the South during the Depression. Obviously, we need that reality of that worn down aspect. We didn't want to overdo it. So we did add some color at the beginnings when the gospel song is coming through the town. Well, starting in this, what they call the backcountry road. The little houses we did there were really much like the reference we saw, but we added elements of color in there. And of course, the costumes, they had quite a bit of color in the costumes that you don't get, obviously, when you look at all the research in the black and white. But basically, most of the settings that we had for our hero characters are in the kind of earth tones, kind of muted, just like you described. Not much pattern on the walls or anything. And then as we progress, we went to a little more color. And then, of course, as Shug Avery comes to town, she comes in with this flamboyant color, and she brings in the color of red. Red is very, very limited early on. And she brings it in. Her car is red. Her costume is red when we see it. And so slowly, as we progress, we find her room that's this shrine in Mr.'s house that's kind of in this deep pink burgundy kind of colors. And then as we progress all the way to the end of the film, some of that color transfers to Celie as she discovers herself and gets stronger. And that kind of color palette went into her world, so much so that at the very, very end, when she's singing in her, what was the hardware store, which was kind of muted greens and whatnot. At the very, very end, I've got this sort of dusty rose, muted historic kind of colors in the background, but she's in the primary red. And there was a conscious effort from Larry and I to bring some of those things in a little more intense color by the time we get to this part in the film.
Getting back to the thing we were talking about earlier about time transitions and how you portray history, I appreciated some of the subtle changes. I think I noticed in some cases where you may have started off with gas lanterns and then transitioned into electrical lighting. And the subtlety of that struck me as this is a really smart way to do this rather than transforming absolutely everything. So I appreciated the attention to that kind of detail.
Blitz always wanted to use technology as a little bit of illustration of change. The cars are obviously a very simple one. It was pretty basic cars at the beginning of our film. And at that time, all our roads were dirt. The main street was all dirt roads. And then when we progressed later, we went to asphalt, paved roads, and of course, all the cars came. And Larry might have more to talk about the smaller details within the households.
Electricity definitely was one of the things that we introduced into the film, but we also did it really sparingly because we did a lot of research about who had electricity and which cities would be electrified and at what date they were electrified. And it was really kind of a slow sort of a progression. So it wouldn't be New York City or Chicago where everything became electrified. It was still a rural area. So that was a little bit of a just a subtle thing that we did. And you'll I think we handled it pretty well, where there might be a fixture or a ceiling fixture or a lamp or two, but sort of that would be the maximum amount. And there were a few things that we had. There were some sort of situations where we talked about having a radio at one point, and ultimately we did have a radio, but we did a lot of research into going, did they even have radio broadcasts at that time? And I think there was one.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate the attention to that detail, and then also defending the veracity of it and saying like, no, we can't do this. One of the things that I'm always struck by, and the reason why I led with the question about musicals is having done a musical myself, I understand that there are certain considerations that are necessary to accommodate sometimes large and elaborate dance sequences with elaborate camera moves. And so sometimes those particular sequences necessitate a scale that is maybe grander than what our characters might normally inhabit, especially if they're people of very limited means. I understand the complexity involved in a lot of that decision making, and I really appreciate the effort that you gave to it, because I felt like you struck a very, very successful balance in the film.
We were lucky that we had Celie's imagination to broaden it somewhat, to go to some of the bigger dance numbers set, because you're absolutely right. The juke joint was very tight space for quite a lot of dancers, and we managed to figure in levels. There could be on the bar, on the tables, but the space was actually quite. It was not definitely not was not a lot of extra space around it. And Miss Celie's pants, which was the conversion of the hardware store, and that again was a tricky one because that was her space. We had already established it. And we just added in an extra level at the back so we could have some other dancers at the top. But it was a very, very tight, quite restrictive place to shoot. But of course, because that was a set, it allowed for the crane and everything from taking big chunks of the set out to get some of those shots in there. So it was tricky. But then we were able to go big on some of the other ones, which was great within her fantasy world. So we were lucky that we had that opportunity.
Yeah, there was some really interesting stuff that went on, getting back to this idea of Celie's perspective and her fantasy world. And the thing that I was really struck by was when she made the discovery of the long lost letters. And as she was reading them and she was sort of visualizing the sister's life in Africa, it seemed like those worlds were colliding visually. And it was a really, really interesting effect.
Yeah, that one. I mean, in the original movie, the Spielberg movie, there was footage of Africa, but we had no intention of doing that because, there's an early scene with Nettie talking. Nettie's her a younger sister talking about this place called Africa, and she talks about it and that they were king. They come from royalty down there. So later on, when we get to, she's reading this letter about my village is being bombed. And I suggested to Blitz, I said, well, we built this little backcountry road. It's like her village. And this little set here, this African village is actually in the same trees. These are the same oak trees. It's just behind this frame. There's actually the village or the backcountry road set, which we built, which we had this opening gospel dance number, this set here. So the idea is she starts in this her village. And then she's reading this letter and she's just walking along. And then at the far end down there, she's actually, in her mind now, the stories from the letters come to life and it's all happening around her, but yet it's still set within the sort of landscape that her village is in. So that's kind of how that happened. It was fun to be able to do it this way. And it was such a beautiful setting. Oh, look, there's Larry walking through the village.
I'm curious, Larry, I know that this sometimes becomes something that factors into musical work, but when the choreographers are staging their stuff, I found myself needing to often provide them with like placeholders for what some of the set pieces were and stuff like that. Maybe you could talk a little bit what that experience was like.
Yeah, of course. There was a lot of crossover. And Fatima, our choreographer, who's absolutely brilliant, and Tia, her sort of right-hand person, they were really great. So I always did my best to give them exactly what they needed. And they also, as you can see in the dance number, there's a lot of physicality. It's not just, like choreographed moves. They are utilizing the set dressing as like action pieces. So it's a little bit almost like dealing sometimes with stunts. I manufactured all of those sort of Victorian, ornate clothing racks, and we had to get up, everything had to be on wheels. It was kind of great. All the sewing machines, everything is on wheels, and they could just all wheel it away. And we had to, use heavy duty casters for them to be able to manipulate, move, and use them as like part of their dance number. And the same thing also in Harpo's juke joint. it's like I found all the old doors and things that we made tables out of because, Harpo started this kind of on a shoestring. And so a lot of it was just found objects that we were trying to like purpose into tables. So it wouldn't look like he went to a restaurant supply store or something. And again, it's all this rickety old crap that we found. And then Fatima's like, we want to get on the tables and like do serious like physical dance moves on them. So that was a bit of a challenge because it turned out not last minute, but it was a little bit under the wire. And, we had to reinforce all that stuff that's rickety, half rotted wood half the time, this stuff we find, and make it be, that dancers could be like jumping off of them and doing flips and doing all this sort of physical dance moves that she had those dancers doing. But she was great. She was an absolute dream to work with.
Yeah, and the whole team was so accommodating because in this juke joint set, I wanted to have warped old boards, and I was terrified, they're going to go trip over things or twist their ankles. And Fatima and the team were fantastic because I was a bit worried that we'd be restricted with so many things, and they said no, just do it. And of course, anything dangerous we will let you know. But there was hardly anything that was needed to be changed and padded or anything. It was fantastic.
To me, it's one of the most fun collaborations. I also wanted to comment, Paul, putting the juke joint at the end of this pier made for so much vivid photography. That was some really beautiful shots with reflections on the water and stuff like that. It just it was a really neat idea.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite sets. The Spielberg movie, they have their juke joint is right on the water as well, and they bought the piano, which was symbolic of the music, on this barge pulled on a cable to the juke joint. And so I thought, I asked Blitz, I suggested, let's have Shug Avery, who is the music in this particular scene, arrive at the juke joint on a barge, just like she's, Cleopatra arriving or something on the Nile. And so that's kind of where that all happened. And, there's the very, very crude test of this to see if it actually would float. And it was very, very stable. So we ended up having that pulled underwater in this swamp. And that's a whole other story about creating the set in the swamp. But that was her barge. That was her arrival. And it worked out amazing. That was one of my favorite scenes, and so powerful when she comes in, so theatrical in that red dress. And, Francine's costume was fantastic for that, in that sort of blue light of the moonlight.
That vivid color also, you feel the import of it in terms of its effect on Celie and how that, like later when she starts to borrow some of that color and it starts to infiltrate her world. It's just very thoughtfully done and so cinematic and beautiful. And I wanted to comment on that. Maybe you can talk about if there was anything in your travels or some of the reference material that you were looking through, Larry, that you were just like, wow, this is awesome. This is going to serve us really well.
Well, I used the Library of Congress, their archives to kind of dig around in, which I always find incredibly helpful for period pieces. And then I'd also found an archive site that was more specific to the American South. And it was an African-American photographer that had contributed a huge amount of stuff to this sort of archive that really sort of chronicled the lives of African Americans in that period. So that was incredibly helpful. And it was just like hitting like kind of like a gold mine. You're like, wow, because it wasn't somebody's perception, like the African American community was not, they weren't widely publicized or recognized, at that time, particularly in a photographic way, unless it was maybe a portrait, a family portrait or something like that. But this was more like everyday life and businesses and things that were really pertinent to what we were doing. So it was incredibly helpful. And I had one of our producers, Michael Bube, had suggested his wife to work as a researcher, and she was fantastic. And she's amazingly lovely and hardworking. And she went to town. She was great. So it helped with all of like the labels for the inside the general store and all the product sort of stuff that we needed to do. And again, for like finding about like, was there a radio station at this time? Was there this? When did electricity happen in rural parts of Georgia? And we kind of were like, used her extensively, and she was fantastic. And I research heavily on my own too. So I just go through and like I got to see it all for myself, and I found like messy old kitchens and things to use that were period appropriate that we could then sort of, use as research to create these environments. And Paul was great too. One of the things I really enjoyed working with him is that he would use an illustrator and we would really physically use exact things that I was finding and shopping, and we would put them in the illustrations, which is a great thing to do. There's not a lot of designers that do that. Often what you have when you work with a production designer is they have an illustrator and they go off in this direction and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, it's not going to look like that. And what we were able to do, we were to present these illustrations that were literally like stepping out of the illustration and into the set.
Yeah, it's just easier. It's easier because people get married to things. They get married to elements in storyboards sometimes, and the director arrives on set and says, well, why does the banister look like that? In the storyboard, it was a different shape. I'm like, Larry found a lot of this stuff early, and we could work them in. So that was a very nice thing to be able to do.
Yeah, and we would literally sit with the illustrator and literally say, no, move that chair in the corner. No, put that over there. Nah, like, I literally like decorated on screen.
Sometimes, funny enough, I was putting together pictures recently for the ADG, and it was hard to tell this illustration from the photo when it was small.
Wow, that's a great process. All set decorators will tip your hat to you, Paul, for that sort of consideration. There's nothing worse than the director going, but there was an Empire sofa in the illustration. You're like, that was an asset that some guy had that he dropped into an illustration. When we go into a historical setting and it's populated by things that at that time were new, which we know now are like, if we see versions of them today, we see much older versions in antique stores, right? Or in museums. And so, for example, like the general store, like what was it like to try and pull together some of the assets that you had to populate the shelves and that dressing? Like what maybe you could talk about that process a little bit.
Yeah, that's the tricky part to do when you have to do something that's supposed to be fresh on the shelf and it's, over 100 years old. So you can find examples of the pieces, but, they're like wood's rotted or the paint's chipped off. But the South also, you've worked in Georgia, it's rotten with antiques, so if you really put in a concerted effort, you can find some things that are in really great condition. And so that's what we did. And then for some of the things that we featured, I had it like cleaned up, painted, use steel wool on it and just kind of make it be the best sort of version that it could be. And then there's a number of vendors, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but he did all the signage in that. It's real period signage, and then Biggers, props in Atlanta. They had, quite a lot of stuff that we rented a lot of stuff from them. And then we manufactured a substantial amount of it. We did the research and we found, containers and things that we would then do the graphics on. Had boxes, that we'd find stock sizes of and then create graphics for them. So we worked really closely with the graphics department as well. And some of that, like say that spice thing that's shown on the shelf there, I found that it was a little bit beat up. So then we just did new graphics on it and just sort of freshened it up. And there's, Van Dyke's restorers. And there are a few places that still, make a lantern that's been made the same way for over 100 years and they still stock them. So there are things like that I was able to get as well. We also had to deal with time, a time transition in there. Like say the coffee grinders, I found that at an auction. I do a lot of auction shopping as well. But yeah, that's a challenge. That is a challenge to do and make it not be a bunch of old rusty stuff in there when it's supposed to be fresh and brand new. And then the went through a number of transitions too. It kind of had its ups and downs and got to a place where it was really depleted. And there was a time when it was like kind of, really going strong. And then, with the advertisement as well, you'll see a transition of things over time. The advertising changes with time.
Paul, what about some of your historical references and things that you drew inspiration from?
Well, strange enough, looking for a church, there's a lot of churches in Georgia. There was a website, which was, Rural Churches of Georgia website, and they had over, I think, 340 or 350 churches. And so at the very beginning, I was still in England. I found this website, and Larry actually has a book. There's a book.
Yeah, they published a book as well.
I went painstakingly through each one, and then you found a Google map, and I went to the Google map, and if you could find it or not. And then I narrowed it down to about 10. And then as soon as I arrived, John Latenzo, the location manager, and I, we drove to all of the 10 that I had seen. And of course, he had a couple more. This was one of the ones that I went to early. It was a bit too grand for us, but it was, the setting was a church on a hill, and that one happened to be on a hill. But we settled eventually on one not too far from Savannah, which was quite a beauty. Very, very simplistic, very small. So this was our little setting. It was a beautiful setting. Dan Lauston, the DP, who's beautiful work. Of course, he hated the church because it was a historic white church. So he was very mad at me for that. There was no way I was going to. There was no way I could paint it. And anyway, he still ribs me to the day about that white church. I told him it's historically correct. It should be white church.
One of the things that I was struck by too, Paul, was the ratio of location versus construction. Maybe you could talk a bit about what that balance was in the film.
Blitz kind of wanted to go as real as possible, So we were trying to do as many things on location as we could. Mister's house, of course, we ended up, it was land bequeathed to the county, I think, for a park. And this was a part that they didn't know what to do with, and it was overgrown, and there was a big chain link fence around the house. It didn't really have 2 stories, and we had to, the script required 2 stories. So, but it was a great setting. It was a great setting with a bridge and a river and a hill. So that was a good thing. But this juke joint, for instance, here, this was one that we scouted a real swamp in near Savannah. But of course, Savannah was a bit of a distant location for us. We had to come back for 3 different time periods. The shack before he starts building it. Then there was this version, which is Harpo's house, and then eventually Harpo's juke joint. But this particular place, which it's a plantation, Starsville Plantation, it's a hunting and fishing lodge now. So they had made several lakes, man-made lakes. So they dammed it, and sort of this about 4 or 5 years ago. And so the trees had died off, and they were almost like a real swamp, but it was a man-made one. So what it afforded us was we were able to drain the swamp enough that this area would be dry, or not really dry. But we put swamp mats down, and then we were able to construction was able to bring machinery in, drive piles and things like that, and build it. And we started with the biggest version first, which was the juke joint. And then we filled it up to the water level we wanted, and we were able to maintain it. If it didn't rain enough, we could pump more from the lake above, or from the lake below. We pumped it up, in fact. And then construction slowly peeled it back to the 3 different layers. And they had to do that from barges and or from the dock itself. So it was logistically, it was a very difficult thing, but we shot the shack there because it was so much interior-exterior connection. And then we shot all of Harpo's house. We shot in that setting in the middle of the water, which was obviously difficult to do. But I think we gained a lot out of it. We gained moving from outside inside. It's just this very, very tiny little space. We didn't really wild any walls. We had to really be careful with that. But and then we shot a lot of the juke joint arrivals and everything on the real one. And then, of course, some of the big fantasy sets we had to build. But essentially, we tried to be very location based. I think it was more for authenticity. And this is the first film I've ever been on that the film is actually, where we're shooting is actually the proper state or area that the film is actually set in. It never happens.
Yeah, I go to Georgia to make movies that take place in New York or San Francisco. As I was looking at the juke joint set, I one of the thoughts I had was, oh my God, what a nightmare that must have been to try and access that place and dress it. And so I thought maybe you could talk about that, Larry.
Well, it was. Because, the only access was that little sort of pier or sort of boardwalk that you had to carry everything in and out of. So it was also incredibly challenging while we were shooting it, because of course they'd want to do dance numbers or move the camera and then go get everything out of here. And you literally had to then walk it out piece by piece as well. So we just kind of kept some vehicles, on the sideline on the shore to be able to throw everything in and, to get it in and out. So we had to have a number of on-set dressers there for those situations.
Would you take a skiff out to the juke joint and take the stuff out that way?
No, the pier connected to land, as you can see in this photo. So that would be where we'd back 5 tons up to, and then carry everything in piece by piece. But it was, it was a bit of a challenge because you want to hang something on the outside of the building, and you're just, all you had under you was water. So we had to kind of get a little crafty with that.
Oh, by the way, nobody fell in. Nobody fell in to be clear, so that no one was injured falling into that swamp. Making of this film.
Yeah, it was pretty scary.
I mean, that picture there, I wanted Sugar Avery to arrive. I wanted her to pull in. I wanted to see all of that. And it's like a proscenium arch. And everyone was a bit upset with me. Visual effects were upset with me, saying, oh my God, but how are we going to deal with, she's on this stage. We have all of that in the background for the rest of the thing that's so expensive. But Dan did an amazing job. I mean, that's the real set on location, but all the rest of the stuff is actually on stage. The little lights, we did smaller lights in the distance because we didn't have enough throw, to get them as far back as they were in the real location. And strangely enough, this set, it was about 15% bigger, and it's still a small set, but we managed to accommodate that pretty big, amazing dance number. So
I think it was a very seamless transition from stage to location work in that particular case, because I didn't take notice of it. Maybe we can go back to the town a little bit and some of the work that was done in the town, and with respect to locations and work that needs to be done. Often they're real places of business and requires careful negotiations with having access to them. Maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Definitely. I think we were pretty lucky with this particular location, because I can't remember the name of the town.
Grantville.
That's right. And it's this little sort of almost a ghost town that like one person owns the majority of the buildings, and they're trying to kind of like turn it into like a little town again and kind of hip it up. So there was like a little coffee shop that they had, but most everything was kind of empty. So we were kind of fortunate. We could really use a lot of it like a backlot. If the interior of the building was too damaged, then we created, window boxes and kind of did like storefront dressing, like here at Miss Celie's Pants, that was just, we could only go in so far because that place was just sort of like, gutted out there. So we just used the entry and the windows to dress there. Across the street, we had the hotel. And again, it was like completely gutted on the inside. So we just dressed the windows kind of heavily to sort of disguise the fact that it was a hotel behind it. Ironically, the little bank that we used had been a bank. And the place that's cotton gin actually was a cotton gin as well. So some of it, because the town was historic, did have a lot of the things in place that would have been appropriate for the time and the region that we were shooting. And then so that's the other thing too. You got to go through and kind of go figure out what would the businesses have been in a place like this in the rural South. And so we did a lot of research to see like what kind of mercantiles there would be, and the hat shop, the dress shop, the suit shop, the produce, the grocer. And, most of those facades, it was paint jobs, signage, awnings that we built. The town, it served us very well. And because it was a little bit off the beaten path and we could have complete road closures, it was really kind of a nice place to shoot and do like all the musical numbers.
I fell in love with a lot of the graphics that seemed so thoughtfully done and so integrated into the setting and believable to me. And I also really fell in love with a lot of the awnings in this town. I thought they were so well executed and felt so natural to me. And awnings are like one of those, this is a very nerdy set decorator thing, but it's like awnings are like one of those things where I'll often see them and I'll get really frustrated because they seem way too tailored. And, when you look at a lot of the historical references, you see they can look kind of janky.
Yeah.
I was like, these are really good awnings. I was very excited to see that up front.
That was very purposeful, Gene. We had found research that I showed to Paul, and I was like, these really great sort of like almost, like half a tent, these dimensional awnings that, would sort of fan up when you close them. And a lot of them did have like a kind of a deep sag in them. And the one over like the general store in particular, it was a retractable awning that was built on rigid framework. And that was another thing that we had seen. So when you opened it, you'd see the sort of the rafters exposed, but when it closed, the fabric just rolled right down over the rafters. So that was something we'd seen in research and knocked off.
Yeah, and Dan was very happy with Larry about that one because, when it's retracted, he can beam a much bigger beam of sun through the front windows because we're using a lot of natural light, because the gas lighting and everything is pretty dim in reality. So he kept it pretty dim, but he would punch a really strong sunlight through the front windows. So, by Larry doing that kind of awning, by retracting it but before we go inside, it was perfect for that.
I'm curious, Paul, when I was looking at some of the illustrations, illustrations often show us very distinct kind of light sources or a sort of a lighting scheme for something. And because so much of it, as I was looking at the illustrations, I was like, it's so vividly represented in the photography. And so what was that process like?
We had a lot of discussion about lights. I mean, I don't know how many meetings we must have had about practicals and how to emulate the gas lamps with non-gas, flickering LED type thing. So I think those discussions happened quite early, and so we were able to accommodate them in the illustrations as well. And I mean, Larry might speak more about his dealings with Dan, but it was so important in the interiors, all these lights. In Mister's house too, there weren't a lot of lights, and so that's why a lot of the lighting is motivated from the windows. And it's quite very, very moody.
It's gorgeous in some of those shots. It almost has like a noirish quality. It's really good. I am curious if there was anything in particular that was really challenging, a challenge that you were presented with and you had to surmount that, and, something unexpected or losing a location and finding something else. And then also, kind of the unexpected result that might come from that. Sometimes those can make for interesting stories.
I would say the biggest challenge was that we didn't have a huge budget. So we had to do it in a really practical, fiscally responsible and creative way. So I lucked out because I'm very big on A, research, and B, shopping. So at the beginning of a movie, I literally go out myself and I send my buyers out, and I run around sometimes with Margaret, my assistant decorator, and we kind of to get us on the same page, to go like, here's the kind of vibe we want, here's the kind of feel we want, so we'll go out together, and we'll just scour and drive, sometimes 4 hours in one direction to get to some little town that might have the kind of stuff that we needed. And it paid off because we found amazing things. And like I said, the South has so much amazing antiques if you really go and you dig for them. So I relied obviously on the prop houses because we had some volume of things that we needed to acquire. And Caps was really instrumental in that because they had done a number of period movies. And so they're really good about, taking on other people's assets. And so they had a tremendous amount of stuff. It's a little tricky sometimes because, as you know, you've been in Caps. You got to kind of hunt and peck and dig for it and go through boxes, but I'm kind of relentless that way.
But for me, the great thing was you brought all this stuff and you made your own prop house, basically. I mean, we had a massive amount of props to go through. And so as we were going, we're like, maybe we'll go, come with me. And Larry dragged me to the back and said, look, pick something out of there. I'm like, oh, Jesus. Yeah. Okay. So there's so much stuff.
Well, you may have a reputation, Larry.
I do.
The hardware store, normally I would have imagined I would have to have made some of those counters, but Larry managed to find real ones that we might have modified somewhat lengthwise or whatever, but he got some amazing ones from, I don't know, Pennsylvania or wherever you got them. I don't remember where you got them.
North Carolina.
And then we just tied them all in. Scenically, we tied the wood colors in so that it all looked like bespoke, including a lot of the stuff from the shelves on the walls and everything. I mean, things that I would not normally have expected that we'd be able to find or source. Larry's team managed to get it in there. So it was great.
What about you, Paul? Was there any particular challenge that stands out in terms of something that was, presented you with a difficulty that you were able to overcome and you were pleased with the result?
Well, the swamp, we've already kind of discussed it. That was a very difficult one. And the guys pulled through on that. I think the hardest location for us to find was actually the house. We looked at so many different houses. I went down so many little farm lanes, and this house was so out of the way down a back road. I can't remember which scout actually found it, but everyone's very friendly in the South and they talk about things. Oh, there's this house, that over there. You should probably go try to find it. It's in the and eventually, I think they were given a rough direction and they Google scouted from by the air and saw this thing down this little path, this sort of rundown path, and they were able to track it down. And I think it was a great score. I mean, this house didn't look like this. It didn't have dormers. It had a modern roof on it. We peeled off more paint than was on there, but it was a great location, and it was overgrown. It was like, I don't know, all the grasses were about 6 feet tall, and you could barely see around here. And of course, greens, we had to, well in advance, we had to plant the garden in the back. And that took a while, because we were shooting the wrong time to grow some of these things. So they're all grown in the greenhouses in pots and then brought in and buried in there. We had this field of, well, it's like the original movie, they're walking through this field of wildflowers. We filled a whole section of the back area of this farm and planted, we chose the colors carefully, what the flowers would be. And we planted mostly in the purples and pink ranges. And then, so that took a while. And I was always a bit nervous about, if there was going to be enough rain, but they brought in we had to build a little building to hide some of their irrigation. And they'd bring in and they'd be pumping it all the time. And then of course he's growing his crop that we had to till, and it was in a floodplain down below this hill that we built that eventually burnt. And so that was a big task. I was a bit terrified that we would actually get all that to grow in the time that we in the right time frame that we had. We didn't have a long growing period, so that was my biggest challenge, to make this look like a working farm. And I think we succeeded. I hope we did.
Absolutely. Well done. Jumping off that theme, was there any particular aspect of the film or a situation or a set that you were just very excited about, delighted with the outcome?
I did enjoy doing the Art Deco we call it the Flying Aces set, because that was the movie theater. Shug Avery takes Celie to her first movie, and she goes into this movie theater set in the late mid-20s, I guess. And, we're pushing the boundaries a little bit with the deco, but then she gets into this fantasy. She's in her dress, and she arrives and comes down the stairs into this beautiful setting with her and Shug, and then this whole band, playing around her. And it was quite a magical moment when they have this duet together. And the sides open up and reveal the instruments, the musicians, I should say, in the lower section. It starts off, we transition from a black and white film to this black and white set. And then as it drops down, they walk down the stairs, it turns into color. But it was, again, a muted palette, really there just to, accentuate our two heroes.
Oh, yeah. It's got the grandeur of like an MGM musical. It's great. So what about you, Larry? What were you excited about?
No, I'm going to sound like a complete geek, but I was excited about the whole movie. The whole thing was an incredible challenge, and not just a challenge in the sense of being challenging, but it was just great to be able to take this iconic piece of work and sort of reimagine it on a lot of levels. So, to kind of go, this is what our version is of what we think Mister's house should be, because people have seen this film. It was an incredibly popular film, and it was, hugely successful. So I think people have preconceived ideas about how it should be. And I think it was really fun to work with Blitz and go, no, we think it should be this, and it shouldn't be. It should be more down. It should be a little more rough. It should, be whatever. And then, like, one of the things that does stand out to me is, like, say when we go to Shug Avery's house, then that was a little bit of a moment of where he had a bit of escapism, because suddenly here we are in this sort of opulent interior with, florals and a party and telephones. And, it's just like a complete escape from the rest of the movie with its sort of rural, sort of down and dingy factor. So that was a great sort of fun set to do. Just little oddities. All the paintings were like African-American artists of the time. And so we kind of put a lot of attention into that. And it turned out, I loved it. I thought it was really great.
I think Larry, you have to talk about the almost one of the final scenes, the tables and the blankets.
The Easter dinner.
Yeah, the Easter dinner. The tree is very important. We open the movie on this particular tree. The young girls are sitting in this tree when they're happy times, and it's that's their memory. And then all kinds of horrible stuff happens. Then we go to the beach, and then Mister comes along, and I proposed this beach, and it's Jekyll Island, by the way. And there was basically some dead live oak, this one here, on the beach. And so I said, it's quite ominous, that they're in this tree, then Mister comes, and we're walking through a sea of these dead trees. And it's just a foreshadowing sort of the ominousness of this character. That's the first time we see him is in this particular area. And then later, when we get back, the script had it as like this big long table in her field, an Easter dinner. And I Blitz and I love this tree. And I said to Blitz, I said, I see this tree as like a tree of life. And, perhaps we do a circle around here. And actually, I don't think it made it to the end, into the final cut of the film, but he had an amazing dance number where we actually, I think the timing may not have worked, but we circled around that tree, and Larry did an amazing job with the actual dressing of this. And there was a circular track inside, and the beat was the same, the song was the same, but the style of the song changes. They traveled around. It was fantastic.
So that's just like, going around and literally collecting every single one of those things, like piece by piece. And the thing with quilts, if you really want to have an old quilt that looks like it really would belong there, it needs to be made with the fabric of the period. But the thing that's difficult with textiles is, as they rot. So it was hard to find things that were period appropriate that weren't, completely threadbare or rotten. So that was quite a hunting. Again, a lot of them I bought at auction, because, you'd find these places that had maybe stored them, or people kept them, really good care of them. So they were in really good condition. And it was funny because Oprah was like, she loved the quilt. She was just like flipped out. like, I want to know where those are going and where did you find these? And it was this really kind of funny moment. But it was great fun too. And like Paul was saying, they had done this sort of circular track inside of those tables. And it was really cool because everything stayed the same. And I had a discussion with Blitz about this because he was like, well, it should all change. And I said, from my perspective, I don't think it would because, people do things, especially around the holidays that are, they're traditional and they're like a family tradition sort of a situation. So I said, in my mind, everything would really pretty much stay the same. We had flowers on the table in little mason jars. I go, we'll change the flowers and we'll change things because, every year that thing is going to be different. But to me, I was like, the way I grew up with family traditions, like you'd use the same dishes, the same tablecloth, the same everything. And that was what you used, like say at Christmas or at, Thanksgiving. So I said, why don't we just kind of keep everything sort of the same? And little subtle things will change because he wanted to give off this passage of time again.
One of the things that it brings up for me is this idea of sort of doing a dress rehearsal for things. We have a very short time to pull things together when we're at an actual location. And so I know that my team and I often spend lots of time in the shop or in the warehouse trying to resolve design and decoration ideas. It's very, very thoughtful that you provided some of those images so that we could make that connection between those things. And it's really just lovely work. And I was also struck by this sequence in the story and very moved by it. And I found myself going, hey, I think my next holiday party is going to have a quilted tablecloth. So well done. Before we close, I just want to ask Larry, are there any vendors that you use, particularly if there was anybody that is an SDSA business member that you'd care to give a shout out to who may have provided you with goods or services that were really useful for the film?
Oh, definitely. I had Sarah Gardner-Gale, who as one of my buyers, and she's also in the SDSA. And she worked in Los Angeles for me. So she would do a lot of like sourcing and get stuff together. We made production rentals with some of the prop houses in LA. Warner Brothers in particular, they were just, Robert is just always so amazing. And he knew that I had, like budgetary limitations, and he's just so accommodating. And Beverly at Universal as well. ISS, Rick is always just like, what do you need? What do you need? That kind of thing. So I really was protected. Sony, which is sadly no longer with us. And then also, of course, Alan and Omega Cinema Props, those places are all so great because they have amazing things that you can like utilize in a period film like this. But above and beyond that, I have a very long history, as do you, with these prop houses, and they're just so accommodating, and they really elevate you, and they kind of help prop you up, for lack of a better term. And then, Lenny Marvin, I use, History for Hire, just for more specific stuff. Premiere, Faux Library, Hollywood Studio Galleries, Practical Props, EC Props. Those were kind of the mainstays, for our West Coast faction. And then Golden Oldies is a company in Atlanta. I don't know if you know them, but they have like giant warehouses with stuff that's contemporary, but they also do a lot of period pieces, and prop source, made to measure for upholstery and drapery, that kind of thing. And then 14th Street Antiques, we rented things, especially for Shug's house, from them. And unfortunately, there's like some of the vendors in Atlanta haven't gotten on board. Like Caps isn't there, and I don't think that Biggers is, but they were also incredibly instrumental in just assisting me and making deals with me to kind of give me all that I needed.
Well, gentlemen, I thank you for your time, and I'm so excited about the work that you've done for this film. You should be really proud of yourselves. And it was lovely chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Inside the Set with Set Décor. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website, setdecor.com.